we'll go ahead and begin. So welcome everybody. My name is Christina Whiting. I am the Principal of Privacy, Enterprise Risk, and Compliance at Tevora. I am joined today by Adorial Bethishu, who is our Associate Manager of Privacy. Today, our discussion is ISO 27701, the Privacy Information Management System, what to look forward to. So during the webinar today, if you do have any questions, please go ahead and put them in either the questions or the chat session itself. We're going to go ahead and monitor that throughout the webinar and also answer questions as we go throughout. So, we'll actually pause on some of the topics, answer them instead of waiting till the end so that we make sure it's nice and timely. We can as well provide the slides to everybody who attends so that you have that. So don't worry about, making any screenshots or taking notes, but we can go ahead and provide the PowerPoint deck and the presentation really at the end of the day or tomorrow. Also, the webinar will be posted on our website. So to go ahead and begin, really the agenda today is really just the overall benefits of ISO 27701 certification. And even if you're not going for certification, really what are the benefits of adopting the standard overall for your privacy information management system? So first, Adorial is going to go over what is 27701. What is it made of? How does it compare? And then what are the different, the differences between 27001, the information management system, and 27701? Why is it beneficial? And what steps do you take in order to, obtain certification and or adopt this standard as part of your privacy program going forward? So with that, Adorial, I'm going to pass it on to you to continue the session.
Cool. Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you for everyone that is joining. So let's go ahead and start talking about 27701. To start off, very briefly saying that it's an extension of 27701, and it's not too much additional to add on to your organization. It's just about building that privacy program, but in terms of actual controls you're hitting, it's not really that much more. So to talk a little bit about the regulation itself, or to talk about the framework itself, we're going to go into the scope a little bit, talk about how you determine the scope for conducting this audit, how the scope might differ from your 2701 audit. We're going to talk about the PIMS. Everyone's probably familiar with the ISMS, which addresses the baseline security functions of the organization. Now you have your PIMS, the Privacy Information Management System, which addresses the baseline privacy functions of your organization. And we're going to talk about some of the additional requirements that you can see in 2701 or in 27701. It takes the PII protection twist to them. So there are some specifics, there's some new policies, new procedures, new functions that are needed. We're going to go through some of them. So starting off, the scope. So generally you can consider the scope of 27701 to include the 2701 scope, to the extent that 2701 is covering personal information protection and everything. The 27701 scope may be a little bit greater because you're now considering business processes and everything that includes the processing of PII, and you might find non-conformities for 27701 related to a business process that has no relevancy at all to 2701. So that's kind of where the difference in scope is that you're really focusing on those PII processes, those PII systems. Sometimes, again, they're not risks to the organization, but it's still something that they want to be checking for 27701. That's kind of where the scope is determined. An organization needs to determine its role as the controller, as the processor, identifying what the industry is, what the regulations are, and then additionally, you want to look at what the context of the organization and what the goals are. So you want to understand what your privacy goals are. You want to understand where you're currently at. It's kind of the same thing that you do for an ISMS, where you determine your security goals for the next year, for the coming years. Same thing needs to be done for 27701. You want to really figure out where you want your organization to be in terms of privacy over the next couple of years. There's a requirement to have a specific point of contact to do this. So if you are seeking 27701 full certification, it's not something that security can necessarily just handle. It's something that they're going to want to see dedicated individuals for, a dedicated team, which is good because then it builds out a good privacy culture in your organization. There's just a brief definition I wanted to talk about of customers down below, which are either organizations that have contracts with the PI controller who is contracted with the processor, or the processor who is contracted with a subcontractor. An organization that is seeking 27701 could have customers who are any of the three, and all of the requirements of this framework apply to any of the three. So that's kind of just tells you that the scope is is pretty broad.
Yeah, and Dory, if you go back to that slide real quick, I mean, this
Sure.
is definitely a key point of 27701, you know, the concept of controller, processor, or subcontractor. You can be multiple of these. It's not just one. And so when you go through and you look at the controls and you look at the scope and everything like that, it's important to really analyze the organization as to what role or roles you play, to see what controls particularly apply to you and how that would or may directly affect your scope overall. This is important because a lot of times 27701 is used to really build privacy programs, really from the ground up and or revitalize existing privacy programs that have been in place for a number of years, and get you to think about different controls that may not have been factored in originally. And so the concept of controller, processor, and subcontractor as part of the scope and program build is definitely super important to make sure that you can accommodate, you know, multiple, you know, privacy regulations globally, not just looking at it from a pure certification standpoint.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. And we'll talk about this a bit more later on, but you'll see that the 27701 framework is really built with the privacy regulations in mind, and the use of this language is definitely just a further attestation to that. They really didn't just consider other ISO frameworks; they consider GDPR as a CPA. So there's a good baseline that you're meeting just by hitting 27701 certification. Awesome. So the PIMS, the Information Security Management System, which addresses the protection of privacy as potentially affected by the processing of PII. So that's a definition from the framework, essentially saying that you take your ISMS and you expand it to include anything that could be affected by PII processing. Similar to an ISMS, it is comprised of a designated, well-trained staff. In this sense, you need a designated privacy management staff. The privacy staff and general staff need to have some sort of data protection training. It's comprised of a good information mapping and processing record keeping. So what that means is that part of the function of the PIMS is understanding the data flows of your organization and understanding the processing activities, third-party relationships. All of that's part of building the PIMS. You can't really do the PIMS if you don't have a good understanding of how data lives in your environment and what that life cycle looks like. It's also comprised of specific privacy policies, procedures, organizational functions. A lot of these specific requirements you can hit in security functions, but there is definitely a lot of additional policies that will be needed to hit this certification. And privacy technology, any technology that you have that is supporting these functions, the data mapping tools, if you have a data subject management program, DLP, whatever it may be, anything that can be used that is completing a critical privacy function, that's now something that you can test against, you can audit against, it's part of your PIMS. So like we said, you want to consider the scope to be generally the same, expanded to include processing. Implementation of the PIMS is kind of the extension of the ISMS. You want to do the same ISMS activities as you would for a PIMS. So in this case, you want to identify the privacy stakeholders, which would be the privacy team, all the business units processing data, who are the data owners on all those teams. So you want to identify all those stakeholders, third parties, management, etc. Determine the goals of the privacy program, the timelines when you can do everything, the costs, is everything actually feasible, and what's needed in terms of in terms of manpower or time, whatever it may be. You got to document the roles. You want to figure out who's doing what, and the roles need to be documented so that there's accountability and responsibility. That's a very big ISO thing across the board. Determining the total scope, which again requires you to look at the organization as a whole and look at where business information lies, where data is being processed. And then you want to draft the PIMS. You want to define everything that's important to your organization. You want to You want to take as much inspiration as you can from existing regulations, try to hit those points in your PIMS to kind of kill two birds with one stone. You need to define the procedures that are going to be in place, what kind of support you're going to have, and what does the actual audit cycle look like for the PIMS. So you drafted it, how are you going to be testing against it, how are you reviewing it, who's going to be doing it. All of the stuff that you do for an ISMS to a smaller extent needs to be done for the PIMS. And then it all wraps up with privacy risk management, which is a control of 27701, but is also a critical component of the PIMS. So that kind of gives you an idea of what the PIMS looks like, just as an extension of the ISMS.
Perfect. And Dora, let's pause for a second because there's two questions. So question one, what that came up was, does designated mean dedicated? And when it comes to the privacy management team, and the answer to that is no. Designated for the privacy management team really means that you are defining what Dora was mentioning, very clear roles and responsibilities. So as long as there's individuals and or roles assigned to privacy responsibility and who's comprised of the privacy management team overall, that is sufficient. You don't have to have a dedicated privacy, team and, specific individuals that are only dedicated to privacy. They can be in other roles that this is just part of their overall responsibility itself. Another question that came up was, as you were just mentioning it and they were reading ahead, so privacy risk management. So privacy risk management, you can actually integrate with security risk management. So you can create a privacy and security risk management program. So if you already have a cybersecurity or a security risk management program, you can augment it with privacy and the concepts that are needed to be put in place as part of that risk management program overall. And a lot of times when you look at privacy, there's obviously a number of significant overlap with technical security controls. So you almost look at that as, privacy engineering or privacy operations. And so you can factor those into the risk assessment and potentially even conduct it at the same time where there's overlap when it comes to technical controls. So it doesn't have to be a standalone process. It can actually be integrated into existing processes as long as you're covering the same topic areas.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. And the phrasing of a lot of the 27701 controls actually makes that true for many of the functions. Many of the functions won't be, standalone things. They'll be extensions of what you're already doing for security. So that makes it certainly makes it a bit easier to hit that certification. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some of the differentiators between 27701 and 27701. We'll talk a bit about, the ISMS versus the PIMS. We'll talk a bit about what are some of those expanded requirements, expanded security requirements that we're seeing. And then we want to talk about ISO 2718, another framework that you may or may not have heard of, but if you are seeking it already, you're already in a good place for 27701. If you're not, then you'll be able to hit 2 certifications with most of the same controls. So starting with 2701, again, the ISMS is defined as the security baseline for organizations, create accountability. The ISMS, the PIMS is the privacy extension of this. Many of the key elements of the ISMS will be replicated to draft the PIMS, and a lot of the policies and procedures will actually be the same. So you might actually find a lot of overlap between the two as you build out the ISMS policies and the information security policies to help meet some of these privacy controls. There will be, of course, a lot of things that are specific to the PIMS, but you can actually see that there might be a lot of overlap between the two, and certainly not by just extending 2701 controls you have in place. Okay, let's go through some of the security requirements. Obviously, this is could be a lengthy section, so we'll just go through at a very high level of some of the main things to look out for. So 27701, human resource security, the expansion is that there's now targeted privacy training requirements for all staff that are involved in PII processing. Depending on your organization, this could actually be a large class of people. It could be, if you have a good data governance program, you already know who your data owners, your data stewards, everything are. So that's a lot of people to be included in the training program. That's a lot of accountability there. You have the additional integration of PII as part of the asset classification schema. And you also have a lot of additional requirements for how you can use media throughout the organization. Talking media, talking about removable media, servers, physical media, hard copy data. There's additional requirements all throughout there of how you can use and how you can print and what kind of permissions are needed. So that could actually lead to quite a bit more policies there. Access control, there's a lot more record keeping that needs to be done for users that are accessing PII, and there also needs to be ability for customers to have their own level of access control for their environments. Cryptography, so there's now the requirement for of a transparency sort of to customers of how you're encrypting their data if that's applicable. And there also needs to be the ability for customers to apply their own encryption. Again, this kind of goes into the whole allowing customers to own their data. This certificate, that's a legal precedent kind of, but the certification really follows through on it. And there's also additional requirements for encryption in transit, encryption over public networks. I'm not sure if this language is specific in 2701, but it's certainly specific now. So there's less leeway for using deprecated protocols and unsafe methodology there. Retention and disposal. So there's now much more explicit requirements for deletion and reuse of storage. There's restriction on hard copy PII use. There's requirements for how you can define retention periods. If you go to the backup portion over here on the upper right, this is actually one of these sections that's been expanded quite a bit. So there's new policies to address how PII has been backed up, what specific requirements are there for PII that's backed up, how is it erased, how is it disclosed, what kind of transparency is there, are you securely overwiping any previous environments, and how are you proving that? What kind of integrity logging is there of PII during any kind of backups or restores? So there's quite a number of controls there that are going to lead to more record keeping, more ticketing, more analysis on the side of the organization. There's a specific requirement about logging, about just how there might be PII in logs, and that of course is a PII risk. So their requirements are now there to watch over how logs are managed and how our logs are erased. So the methodology of maintaining logs indefinitely or maintaining them for too long or whatever it may be might not fly as it used to, but again, it's good to just have that retention lined up with the logging practices. Development, this is actually one of the, oh, sorry, go on, Christine.
I was just going to say, Adorial, so on the logging one, this is super important, especially for healthcare industry and everything. So really specifically calling out, the storage of PII. So if you're a technology provider or within healthcare, it's been, a little bit common in the past for potentially PII to maybe leak into some of the log files and everything. When it comes to verbose logging and what's needed for application debugging and or support for patients or customers or what have you. Really 27701, starts to go down that privacy path for the regulations in order of the protection of the consumers and of themselves, and making sure that PII is decreased when it comes to being found within the log files, just overall. So whether obfuscate them, whether masking them, whether truncating them, or what have you when it comes to viewing, even if it is, stored or initially collected. They're really going into detail to reset the precedence of, what does logging mean? And when you go to verbose logging, how can you, stop the storage and collection of PII in order to protect the end consumer overall?
Yep, absolutely. And there's definitely an emphasis throughout the framework to make sure that PII in all locations, not just the primary databases, PII in metadata, PII in temporary files, in communications, whatever it may be, there's specific requirements of making sure all of that is accounted for in logs. So it really does help to tighten the data exposure of an organization beyond what an organization might even consider to be PII. So there's definitely a huge benefit there when you consider these requirements. So going down the line, so to development, this is actually one of the important ones because we have, I'm sure everyone's heard of the privacy by design requirement from GDPR, and you have an understanding of it to some extent. There's now a testable, implementable procedure that you can work on, that you can have an auditor check against, and now you can say, I have implemented privacy by design to an extent. And this is something that the organization has some freedom in, but there is guidance, of course, given in the framework of how to do it, and there is, of course, the public available literature on that. There's also restrictions now on the actual use of PII in any kind of development environment, which might even lead to difficulty for people that are truncating or anonymizing PII. There might be some additional restrictions needed there even. But the use of PII in development has definitely been tightened down as part of this regulation, as part of this framework. Suppliers is definitely one of the largest sections that's been expanded. It's actually been expanded much beyond just the supplier security portion of 2701. There's plenty of additional requirements in terms of contracts, in terms of PII protection, responsibilities, data subject requests, security, privacy audits. All of that has been expanded, and it's really one of the key components of any privacy regulation, of course, is the outside parties that are accessing the data, and 27701 definitely hits those requirements. So that's just to give you an idea of some of the security requirements. Again, there's tons and tons to go through. That's some of the key ones that stuck out during our analysis. So talking about 2718. So 2718, if you're familiar, is titled Privacy for Public Cloud Processors. That kind of limits the scope already for most people, as most companies are not public cloud processors. The emphasis, if you read through the controls, the framework, the emphasis is more so placed on technical controls for information that's in the cloud environment rather than the management of privacy within the organization. So you have a lot of 2718 audits, you see a lot of controls about data restores and encryption and looking at log files, tickets, and et cetera. Not so much about looking for privacy policies and everything. 27701 actually takes a lot of those 2718 controls I just talked about, those technical controls. Those are all, a lot of them are present in 27701. The difference, of course, is the expansion for 27701 to now hit the organization. So now you have your technical controls, which if you already have 2718, you're already hitting the technical controls. You can expand and hit the organizational controls now, and therefore seek 27701 certification. Some of the requirements that kind of map easily between the two, there's the use of hard copy data, storage media, data retention, access management, encryption, implementation, testing for those is near identical between the two. So if you're already seeking one, it's not too much work to seek the other. If you are considering one, you could potentially seek both. There's definitely a lot of mapping between the two that makes it beneficial for anybody seeking certification. Cool. So let's talk a little bit about some of the benefits of why you should actually consider certification. So first off, the certificate itself is a benefit. Let's go into the public perception, and then of course, what I think is the biggest benefit of this framework is where does this put you in terms of compliance with the law? So first off, certification. Since we've, our practice started focused on GDPR, since we've been doing all of our privacy practices, impact assessments, everything, we've always been asked by customers, is there any kind of attestation report, certificate, whatever I can get? And the answer has generally been no. The governing bodies aren't certifying, they're not auditing or anything so much. So really it was up to an organization to just build trust with a good privacy policy. Now you actually have an independently verified certificate that attests to the privacy of your organization. And this is hugely useful if you have a 2701 certificate, you know the kind of the weight that gives you in building trust. This kind of does the same on a privacy standpoint. This also could certainly help you circumvent any independent privacy audits. For example, if you're a supplier for Microsoft, Microsoft has a large data privacy audit that all their suppliers need to go through. Having a 27701 certificate will pretty much put you at a good place for such an audit. And there's similar audits conducted by Google and plenty of other third parties. So it certainly will put you in a good place to help meet any independent audits. And that certificate is also beneficial for public perception. So the general ask for privacy attestation is now answered. Organizations can put that certificate in a public-facing manner. They can have it out there. It's a good marketing tool. And we put some statistics here from a recent study conducted by KPMG just to give you an idea that people are really not trusting organizations right now to use their data. It's actually pushing people away from some organizations. I know, for example, with everything that's going on with Apple recently, I've certainly been reading a lot that people want to move away from Apple over privacy concerns. This is certainly the age where bad privacy PR can lead to loss of business. And these are statistics that say that almost 100% of the country, 86% of people, that's a huge percentage. That might as well be everybody, says that data privacy is a growing concern. Most are concerned about how companies are collecting and how they're using, and a small percentage are actually unwilling to just share data in the first place. So if you have a independent privacy attestation that you can point to, you're providing a level of trust to all these people that says that we're not only protecting your data, we're not only trying to meet the baseline requirements of the law, we're going above and beyond. We're seeking independent certification. We care about privacy. This really is something powerful to present to potential customers. And compliance mapping, again, definitely the most beneficial portion or most beneficial part of this framework. So you now have a single certification that could establish the framework for organization, which will cover most legal requirements for these individual privacy regulations. So let's go through just a handful of them.
If we can go back to that real quick, Adoriel, yeah, no, absolutely. So I know the question frequently comes up of, how does compliance mapping help? How does it really look at, single certification, using this framework, et cetera? It really comes down to the scope statement. The scope statement that you select for ISO 27701 is super important. So you can specifically call out data privacy regulations. You can call out particular sets of services. You can do it locations. You can do it in a number of ways that really enables this intent. So really, it's about the art of the scope statement in and of itself, in order to provide an accurate reading that's beneficial to your customers and clients, to know that you're covering all the aspects that you should be, to provide like a single certification aspect to support privacy overall. So this sentence or this particular concept is really comes down to the scope statement.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. And that definitely gets rid of a lot of the ad hoc privacy management that we see now that there's the ISO requirement to put everything in writing. So this is beneficial for the customer and for the organization itself. Cool. So some of the points that we want to bring up just between 27701 and some of the regulations. So one of the big ones is, of course, privacy risk assessments and privacy impact assessments. The privacy impact assessment is analysis of a business process to make sure that the privacy concerns of that process are considered. A privacy risk assessment is broader and kind of focuses on the risk of the organization, but in terms of privacy. The PIA requirement, the privacy impact assessment requirement, has been there since GDPR, and you can find it in most regulations. The privacy risk assessment requirement is something that's more coming up in recent regulations and amendments. For example, the California Privacy Rights Act, which is an amendment of CCPA, has the new requirement to perform such an audit. And we've seen it come up in the Virginia Privacy Act, which is another new regulation. There are certain elements in GDPR. And I think that this is the requirement for these audits is going to be something that's going to keep coming up, and that we might even see amendments to existing regulations for. And again, one of the huge benefits here, you need to do a privacy risk assessment either way. Previously, you would have to depend on the vague language that you see on the right, which doesn't really tell you much. Now you can look at the left side, and that tells you, a little bit more. The actual ISO framework gives you a little more guidance, and then now you actually audit against it, certify against it, so you have the help of an auditor, an outside body that helps you get to that point. Prior, you're just going off of a paragraph in a law. Now you actually have a framework to build off of. So hugely beneficial in that sense. Going to the next one, this is focusing on marketing restrictions. And I pointed this out because I wanted to point out that, like we said earlier, 27701 really does put an emphasis on the regulations, not just being another ISO framework. There really is consideration for what are the requirements of individual privacy regulations. This is a huge one. Even before GDPR and a lot of the stricter regulations, marketing was one of the activities that privacy regulations always would put something on. Even before data subject rights, there was always marketing restrictions and consent and everything. Now those consent requirements are specifically called out, what you need to do, what you can and cannot do, what needs to be in policy. That's all called out in 27701. And if you hit those marketing requirements there, then you're hitting the same baseline requirements in GDPR, which are actually in 27701 is they have a good mapping between 27701 and GDPR, just to further illustrate that point. But this is also the same requirement is pretty much prevalent or present in every privacy regulation. So another privacy-focused requirement that you're getting from an ISO perspective that will help you meet what the law says. And another similar one, access, correction, erasure. This is talking about data subject rights, essentially. Can the organization actually meet the right or the request of an individual to access, correct, erase their data? On the right, we see the Act on the Protection of Personal Information, APPI from Japan. This paragraph here, again, tells you what you need to do in terms of correcting and erasure and what timelines. On the left, on the ISO side, it tells you that exact same thing, but it also kind of gives you a little bit more guidance on building that procedure and building that policy. And hitting the 27701 requirement here, this pretty much hits every privacy regulation that has a data subject request element to it. And we could go through, that table I talked about that maps between 27701 and GDPR is 4 pages long, I think. So there's plenty that could be mapped between the two. Some of the focused privacy stuff that we see in the regulations that you are now, these are things that clients bring up as questions all the time, is how do we actually do this? What do we need to do? These are now answered by 27701. PII record keeping and processing activities, what kind of privacy audits to do on your suppliers, what kind of logging needs to be in place specific to PII, contract management for suppliers, what kind of technical security safeguards for PII need to be in place, how do you manage a data subject request, what kind of data protection, data privacy individuals need to be in the organization, do we need a DPO, do we need a team, how do we appoint that individual, what are their roles and responsibilities, and the integrity of data, accuracy of data, having policies and procedures in place to make sure that those two are met is a huge component of every privacy regulation, and also for ensuring accurate data and a successful business. So these are all things that 27701 now tells us how to do that previously the law just told us to do. So that is hugely beneficial to us. All right, so we've talked a lot about the regulation. Let's talk a little bit about some of the steps to take first, not to put too much work onto anybody seeking this. First step is identify resources. Make sure you have the right people. Like Christina said, it does need to be designated staffed individuals. It can be individuals that are trained and aware, but they need to be focusing on privacy in this sense, not just privacy as an add-on, but privacy as its own function. A data inventory is not a hardline requirement of 27701, but it's very, very difficult to seek certification without it. A component of meeting a data subject request is actually knowing where data is. A component of doing encryption and accuracy and minimization. These all require a good understanding of data throughout the environment. And an organization does not have a data inventory, data mapping, doesn't have a data mapping solution, or doesn't manually track how data is flows throughout the environment, you're going to find yourself in a much more difficult place actually hitting 27701 compliance. Once you do the inventory, data governance, how are you overseeing all that data? Who is responsible for it? How are you classifying it? Who are the owners? When is it deleted? All that needs to be on paper as part of the PIMS, and also prior to the PIMS, even. That's just part of the privacy statute of the company. Conducting a scope analysis, so really looking at your organization, talking to all the business units, determining what needs to be included, determining if it's the same as 2701, if there's more to be included. This could actually be a lengthy portion as you talk to different business units and uncover more and more third parties and processes that need to be included, and talk to more and more people. Generally, though, you don't want to ignore any PII processing activities when we're talking about a scope analysis. And once you have everything down, you are now in place to conduct a gap analysis. If it's your first time doing anything for privacy, you might be in a pretty you might have a lot of work to do, but if you've already taken some action, you know, trying to hit GDPR, CCPA requirements, looking at some of the privacy regulations around the world, and you've already done a good job in terms of security, maybe you already have an ISO certificate, your SOC certificate, whatever it may be, you might actually find yourself in a much better place than you think you are just by doing this gap analysis. And that brings us to the end of the discussion. So I know that we went through a lot, but we want to open the floor up to QA. Yeah, and Christina, was there anything else that you want to share before we go fully into the QA section?
No, so I've been monitoring kind of like the questions as we go through, and you've been answering them, or, you know, the reason I've jumped in is to answer them as they've come up. So it doesn't look like we have, you know, any additional questions. So, you know, with that, wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. If you do have any additional questions on ISO 27701, the approach to take when it comes to adopting it, whether it be as a standard for privacy by design, or, you know, for certification as a whole, and how do you integrate it within your current compliance models, feel free to reach out to Adorial or myself. And again, you know, we'll send out a link of where this recording will be, along with a copy of the PowerPoint deck. So just wanted to thank everybody again for attending, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you to everybody.